What non-political opinion gives away someone's politics? Professor Robert A.L.T.E. Meyer did a whole huge study on this, and found out that there were no non-political opinions that reliably predicted whether someone self-identified as extremely liberal, centrist, or conservative, but that if someone answered strongly agree to all three of the following three statements, he could predict with 99% confidence that they self-identified as extremely conservative. Old things are always better than new things. It makes me physically ill to see two things touching that shouldn't be. It is very important that everybody knows who they have to obey and who has to obey them. Exaggerated nostalgia. Exaggerated disgust reflex. Social dominance orientation. I feel this falls apart because it's not being applied to real life. I like alignment because I find the idea interesting in the same way I might find other fantastical nonsense interesting. Saying it's inaccurate to real-world morals comes across to me like saying giants are inaccurate to the square cube law. It's just kinda irrelevant. Weirdly enough, almost any opinion related to disgust. This quiz asks non-political questions and determines if your brain is more right-wing or left-wing. The theory behind this is that people who identify as conservative tend to have a stronger reaction to disgust. Like, for example, a question might be whether or not you would go to a park where you see a rat. Okay, so one person might go it's outdoors. That's where animals live. Yes, I'd still go. While another person might think gross. No. If it's infested with filth and vermin, then I am not going to go in there and catch some disease. That second reaction would be one that is associated with someone who is more conservative. Draw your own conclusions, but it's a weird notion. I would rather eat fruit than paper. No shit. Anyone who says they would rather eat paper is undermining the integrity of the test. If the point of that question is to throw out anyone who disagrees with it, then that's cool, but I think this theory is pretty hogwash. Full disclosure, I'm pretty liberal and I get disgusted extremely easy. Seeing rust on cars makes me feel weak at my knees. I thought it would be the other way around, since liberals tend to emphasize empathy while conservatives tend to emphasize personal responsibility. It does make sense to me that in a lot of situations conservatives would react with disgust whereas a liberal would react with understanding. Drug addiction, since conservatives tend to be more punitive with their policies, but as other commenters said, the test itself seems pretty bogus for many reasons. That quiz is definitely a failed experiment. I can be grossed out by all those things and still lean heavily liberal, whereas it seems to think I should be Republican because I don't want to touch a dead person. One anecdote, but I just took it and it was inaccurate for me. I think this quiz neglects to recognize factors such as OCD, anxiety, or germophobia. LOL. I got 59% Republican, which sounds about right to me as I have always considered myself to be center-right on most issues. Definitely wouldn't say I'm far-right, and I don't think leftist politics are evil. I'm Canadian and I voted for both the Liberals and Conservatives federally, and in my upcoming provincial election I plan to vote NDP, for the first time in my life, despite ideological differences, as our Conservative government has been awful and needs to be held accountable. Is it a friendly rat and will it let me scratch its whittle chin? What a shit quiz. Not just the theory behind it, but the overall structure is terrible. It's full of double negatives and confusing questions, and the format for your answers changes partway through with no indication, not even a color change. Like genuinely fucking terrible. Seems like something a high schooler designed. Huh. It said I'm a Republican and I'm just barely right of communism. Yeah, I read this too. The disgust reflex was the most interesting, because it was quite visceral. Hardcore conservatives were really, honestly grossed out by, like, foods they normally enjoyed prepared slightly differently, or if food touched other food on their plate. I wrote a paper in college psych on the biological roots of political/religious bias. This theory isn't too far off. There's a good bit of research suggesting a trend between conservatism and fear-based responses, For example, conservatives tend to have larger regions of the brain responsible for danger and fear responses than liberals. Essentially, conservative brains tend to view novel experiences and outgroups from a threatening lens, while liberal brains tend to be more open to those scenarios. It's a really interesting chicken or the egg scenario with massive implications for our politics. Are people wired to lean one way or the other, or does the brain rewire itself based on our ideological values that promotes a sort of feedback loop where things we think are scary actually become physically scarier to us? That's very interesting. One of the things I noticed as I read the three statements is just how carefully they are worded. I became interested in that sort of thing after I began taking online surveys for one of the bigger survey companies. They administer surveys and polls for all sorts of other entities, and the ways in which wording can be manipulated to manipulate results is fascinating to me. Most surveys for market research are carefully worded so the businesses can get the most accurate results possible, and find out what people really think of their products. I've read some real doozies, though, that were opinion polls about an individual. More than one was constructed so that it was impossible to say anything less than wonderful about the person. I've been watching people's reading skills and comprehension slip for years now, and I wonder a great deal about how easy they are to manipulate. It is very important that everybody knows who they have to obey and who has to obey them. My chickens are conservative. Makes sense. Things should never change or be different is conservatism. The belief that old things are better than new things is basically just the definition of conservatism. Could these not also just be questions that autistic people would agree with? My best friend is on the autism spectrum and hates change and things being out of order, but is definitely not conservative. I was just talking with a friend about the good evil chaotic lawful alignment axes in D&D and other similar tabletop games. We observed that our more right-leaning friends tended to lean into and enjoy these mechanics, and use them to tell stories about vast battles between the forces of good and evil, while our more left-leaning friends tend to ignore alignment altogether. It got me thinking about how this difference may be reflective of different metaphysical beliefs common among left and right-wing people. Conservatives tend to put a lot of stock in existing social paradigms, gender, money, law, the Constitution, etc., so it makes sense that a system where good and evil aren't just value judgments but measurable metaphysical forces, as real as gravity or light, would appeal to them. On the other hand, leftists tend to view those categories as arbitrary, often coercive social constructs, so it makes sense that they'd be more skeptical of a game that asserts that good and evil aren't emergent properties of human social dynamics, but unchanged, tangibly inscribed into the fabric of the universe. I never really saw any connection with political opinion and RPG alignments, otherwise I'd be voting Republican since I love in-depth alignment mechanics, lol.